My name is Caitlin Louise Emmerich, and I was born on the 25th of August, 1995, which makes me 26 years old. And I'm currently living on the west coast of Tasmania, which is the part of Australia that people often forget about as it's separate to the mainland. And in the town that I live in, there's only about 2,000 people. It's a very small town in a very remote location on the west coast of Tasmania called Queenstown. If there are lucky Fabry sufferers, then I am one of them because I was diagnosed at birth with Fabry disease. And I have a very different story to someone like my dad, who went through his childhood and adolescence with a mystery illness, suffered immensely, and had really no idea what was causing his illness. As I said, for me, I knew for as long as I can remember, I knew that I had Fabry disease. And this was made known to me at quite a young age by my parents. And it was something that has been openly talked about throughout my life. And especially as I watched this illness have a massive impact on my dad's life growing up. So we would often talk about the kind of symptoms that we were experiencing, our experiences with health professionals, and our concerns and worries about the future and the future impact of the illness. My dad was diagnosed with Fabry disease in his late 20s, and his diagnosis came about as the result of a family relative who was diagnosed with Fabry. So my relative that I'm speaking of was my great uncle, who was living in Holland and passed away. He had suffered with an illness throughout his life, which was not diagnosed until an autopsy was performed, and that autopsy revealed that he had Fabry disease. So when that diagnosis was made as a result of the autopsy, family members were tested for Fabry disease. And my grandmother was confirmed to be a Fabry sufferer, and also my dad and his brother as well. So my grandmother had 4 children. She had 3 sons, one of which was my dad, and a daughter. And out of those 4 siblings, 2 out of the 4 were confirmed Fabry sufferers, being my dad and his brother. My uncle passed away with Fabry disease about 10 or so years ago, and he suffered from kidney disease. His kidneys failed, and he ended up going on dialysis for quite a period of time, and suffered and eventually passed away when he was just 50, a few days after his 50th birthday. So as I said before, I feel grateful that I had a very different experience to my dad, having been diagnosed at birth and having known this illness and being able to understand my own journey with that insight, compared to my dad, who suffered a lot and has had several relatives pass away due to complications resulting from Fabry disease. And he now is the only surviving family member with Fabry disease, as well as myself. So the only female Fabry sufferers that I know of in my family is myself and my grandmother. But due to the fact that my grandmother passed away when I was very young, probably 5 years old, so about 20 years ago, I was never really able to have conversations with her about her experience with Fabry disease. And on top of that, she had only discovered that she had the disease about 5 years prior to that. So I don't have a lot of information about her experience with the illness, and I was never able to have conversations with her about her journey with the illness. My dad has suffered symptoms of Fabry disease for as long as I can remember, and these have been both physical and mental. So it has significantly impacted his quality of life. So his ability to participate in sport with me, his ability to go on holidays and have energy to enjoy things. It really is hard to think of things that haven't been impacted by the disease, really. And so with that impact, I guess my experience of Fabry disease has been twofold. I'm obviously a sufferer personally, but I've also been a carer for my dad with the illness. And I suppose the most severe impact of Fabry disease has been the impact it's had on my relationship with my dad and my family unit, being my mum, myself, and my dad. It has caused a lot of strain on those relationships, and that has been not only because of the physical impact of Fabry on my dad, but also the mental impact, being that he's suffered with depression for most of his life. And so that has meant that he hasn't always had the patience or the tolerance that you would hope for in a father, because he's been suffering with chronic illness. And I guess the difficulty in that is that I empathize so deeply with him and his experience, but also I then feel the impact of the things that he's going through as well, having lived with him for most of my life. So the impact of Fabry disease has been far-reaching. As I said, it's actually hard to imagine what our life would look like without it, because I think it would look so, so different. I first saw a specialist about my illness when I was 5 years of age, and that was Dr. Ellaway at Westmead Children's Hospital, which was about 2 hours away from where I was living in New South Wales. And at that point in time, I wasn't really suffering from any major symptoms. It was basically an annual check-in to check my bloods, check my heart and my kidney function, to ensure that things were going well. And I had my first experience of Fabry symptoms probably in primary school. I would say around the age of 10 or 11. I started to realize that the way that I was feeling things with my hands and feet was not normal, or was somehow different to others. And so, to highlight a major realization I had, was that I realized that I was very uncomfortable to walk barefoot on carpet, that the sensation of that would be really uncomfortable. And so I just got in the habit of wearing shoes and slippers around the house. And around that age of 11 and 12, I made the discovery that that was not a problem that everyone had. That was something that was quite personal to me. And so that helped me to realize that I was experiencing neuropathy, which means that I don't have a great sense of touch, and I especially don't have a great sense of temperature. And that has become more and more of an issue as I've got older. I often will run the bath too hot and discover that too late, or run the dishwashing water far too hot or far too cold, and it will take me sometimes a few minutes to realize that the water temperature is not ideal. And again, these issues, they're not something that you really pick up on until later in life, because you don't know how other people around you, other children, are experiencing the world. And it's not until you can really verbalize how things feel that you realize that maybe they feel different for you than they feel for the people around you. So that is my earliest recollection of a Fabry symptom. The other symptom that I suffer from time to time is something that I call a Fabry attack, which I would estimate happens about once every year or 2 years. And it's usually brought on by stress, whether that be mental sort of stress at work or from study, or whether it's something physical, like I've run down and had a head cold. And a Fabry attack will be a really intense period of pains in my hands and feet that are a burning sensation, temperature changes from feeling extremely hot to extremely cold. And sometimes different parts of my body will feel different temperatures. So my hands might feel hot and I'll have burning sensations, but other parts of my body will be cold and I'll be shivering. It's super unpleasant, as I'm sure you can imagine. On top of the temperature changing and pain, there's also joint aches that I get, especially in my hips and in my shoulders, which is a deep throbbing pain. And I've found that really not much helps these Fabry attacks, and it's more waiting a period of time for them to pass and just resting in that time. But after they've passed, which will generally be within a sort of 6 to 12 hour period, I feel so exhausted from it that it takes me a few days to recover. So as a female Fabry sufferer, I feel as though I've been navigating the unknown in many ways, because until reasonably lately, it was believed that Fabry female patients were only carriers of the disease and didn't actually suffer any symptoms of Fabry. So what that has meant is that there's not a lot of stories that have been shared from female Fabry patients. And part of that is also the fact that not many females have actually been diagnosed compared to males, because for so long it was believed that those symptoms wouldn't be as a result of Fabry disease. So I feel as though there's not as much information or knowledge about how Fabry female patients experience the disease. And I'm grateful now to be part of a community where I can talk to other female sufferers about our experiences and share that with one another. I currently am not presenting severe symptoms, and there hasn't yet been a conversation with me about what options might be available to me in terms of treatment if my health does deteriorate. And that's concerning to me. I am aware of a Fabry female patient who has been suffering with symptoms for quite some time. And after quite a few years of pushing to have treatment, was finally allowed to have that treatment. And that's quite concerning to me, because it does seem apparent that due to the lack of knowledge and, I guess, cases of Fabry female sufferers, that it may be harder for me in the future to access that kind of treatment. And it especially concerns me that it might be that by the time I'm able to access treatment, my health has deteriorated quite significantly. I do remember a moment being the cross country when I was in grade 5 and wanting to participate in a cross country, and having really conflicting views from my parents. I decided that I would go for it and see how I went. So I ran the cross country and I did fairly well, and I felt quite hot and fatigued afterwards, but ultimately felt great that I'd been able to participate and complete it along with my peers. And so that was, I guess, the first moment where I ever felt I may need to tell someone at school that I had this disease, because until then it really hadn't felt relevant to tell teachers or tell other students. And so from that day, it did become something that I wondered whether I should tell people. And I didn't tell my peers until I was in grade 7 or 8 in high school. And it was only the fact that we had been learning about the body in biology, and we'd been learning about our genes and genetic mutations. And essentially, I felt as though that was my time to shine. That was the most fitting situation to disclose to my peers and teachers that I had a genetic mutation and a chromosomal defect, and it was only the fact that it felt so relevant that I disclosed it in a very casual sort of manner. Yeah, I raised my hand and told the teacher, actually, I have an illness that affects my X chromosome. Um, and the kids really didn't make a big deal out of it. I don't think they asked too many questions. It was felt pretty okay for me to tell them. So the first specialist that I was seeing at Westmead was Dr. Ellaway, who was absolutely lovely and super warm and just friendly. And I saw her until I reached adolescence. And then I started seeing Dr. Michael Chen also at Westmead. And he has also been tremendously helpful and lovely. And most recently has been great in giving me some information about fertility options that will be available to me in the future. So both doctors have been incredible, and I have been really grateful to be in their safe hands throughout my journey. Something that I feel has been missing throughout my experience is there's never been any offers for mental health support. And I'd say that is actually the most challenging aspect of the illness, both in my capacity as a carer and a sufferer. The advice that I would give to newly diagnosed patients is that the physical impacts of the disease are no doubt potentially severe, and they're things that your doctor can help you with. They can offer you prevention strategies like, living a healthy life, eating nutritiously, sleeping well, and making good lifestyle choices. But it's not often talked about how the disease might impact your thoughts and internal monologue. And certainly for me, it has had a profound impact. I essentially have had 3 family members die as the result of the illness. My great uncle, my uncle, and my grandmother, although her death was due to multiple health complications, both related and not related to Fabry disease. But when you watch people die from the same illness that you have, it's deeply upsetting and scary. And that's been even more compounded by the fact that I have watched my father suffer with this illness my entire life. I don't have a recollection of him ever being a healthy, well person. And so when you're constantly having these experiences with your loved ones, suffering from the disease and suffering with the same exact disease that you have, it inevitably carries a lot of anxiety with that. And so that has led me to have deep thoughts about what my future looks like, what my health will be like in the future, and how Fabry will inevitably impact me in some way. And it's something that people can't really mitigate for you. Like, there's nothing really that anyone can say that will ease my mind of those concerns. And so you essentially have to find ways to live with that. And that is not something that you should have to do alone. That is something that warrants support of friends and family, but also professionals, counselors, and psychologists to help you develop methods of dealing with those concerns and anxieties, because they will come in tremendous waves. And sometimes it doesn't feel as though they will pass. And there's an irony in spending so much time worrying about the future, because you're essentially drowning in your thoughts before you're even suffering physically. So before you're even presenting symptoms, you might be suffering mentally with the fear of what the future might hold. A few years ago, I got involved in a running event called Parkrun. And I understand that Parkrun is not only Australia-wide, but worldwide. So some of you might be aware of it. It's an event that takes place on Saturday mornings, a community event that's free where people gather together and run 5 kilometers. It was something I was very reluctant to become a part of. In fact, I remember my mum actually coming me in every Saturday morning for about a month, trying to get me out of bed to come and do this run with her, that her and her friends were enjoying. And being a teenager, I didn't really want to get out of bed that early in the morning. But after some pressure, I eventually succumbed to it and went and tried parkrun with her, and just absolutely fell in love with running and the community of parkrun. And from there, I just didn't stop really. I ran every Saturday, and then it became twice a week, and then it became a 6-kilometer fun run for charity, which then became a 12-kilometer fun run for charity. And then eventually I realized that I could try a half marathon. And again, it was that moment where I almost had my parents' voices in my head, my dad being like, yes, go for it, super excited, super enthusiastic, and then my mum sort of having reservations and concerns about how that might affect me. But it was something that I at least wanted to try. And I actually remember reaching out to a Fabry patient Facebook group and putting a group message up saying, hey, has anyone tried this? Has anyone with Fabry disease run a half marathon? Like, did you die or are you okay? Like, should I try it? And I actually got a ton of messages back from people all around the world saying that they'd done it, and even patients who had run a full marathon. It was absolutely incredible. And so I began training and eventually ran a half marathon, which was an extremely massive milestone for me, an amazing achievement. And it really highlighted the fact that as a Fabry patient, you don't know what your boundaries are, you don't know what you're capable of unless you try. Fabry disease by its nature affects people in such a diverse range of ways, and there's a whole spectrum of severity. So it may be that there's Fabry patients who certainly wouldn't be able to run a half marathon, but it may be that there are those that can, like myself. And so it's worth trying things to find your limitations, and equally it's worthwhile fighting those limitations so that you can respect them. And I know that has been something that I've really discovered in adulthood, is understanding my own limitations, how much I can take on board, certainly with my work, and just knowing how much is enough for me to cope with. And that's something that not just Fabry patients should discover. It's something that everyone discovers at some point in life, what their limitations are. But I would say it's especially important for people with Fabry disease so that you can keep yourself really well and healthy. From the perspective of being a carer and a sufferer of Fabry disease myself, my advice to anyone who is experiencing Fabry disease is that you really take your health into your own hands. As much as this disease can and will impact you in ways that you have absolutely no control of, there are so many things that you can do to enhance your quality of life and be proactive about it. And so that would be living a healthy lifestyle, and it would also be really being conscious of your health and seeing professionals regularly. For example, seeing someone to support you with the mental battle that the illness can be. So whether that's a counselor or a psychologist, and meeting with them regularly to manage those fears and anxieties that you might have about the future.